Farm Basics is brought to you by the Liberty Link trait and Liberty herbicide from Bayer. The most reliable weed management solution, Liberty Link and Liberty herbicide are the link to efficient row crop production and sustainable weed management.
During our Farm Basics time today, we're going to talk a little about tilling and planting in wet soil. Now, if you're a non-farmer, you may say, well, you know, if the soil's a little bit wet, that shouldn't hurt too much, right? But boy, as a farmer, we understand that there's a critical point there where, yep, I can have some moisture, but I definitely don't want too much.
Well, one of the big things that we're concerned about when we're planting seed is getting good seed to soil contact. We want that seed to be pressed firmly with soil around it, but we don't want to have compaction. And what we can have sometimes when we get wet soil is we can get sidewall compaction. So we slice through that wet ground and those walls along the side of the seed just become rock hard as they dry out later in the season. And what happens is then when the plant wants to send roots out, they've got this hard wall on either side, and instead of roots being able to spread out, the roots just kind of go up that furrow and that's it, and we end up with issues later in the season, and it definitely limits our yieldability.
When we talk about just tillage in general, any type of tillage in wetter soil will typically cause compaction, especially in heavy clay soils. So these soils that can normally hold a lot of moisture, unless they dry out to the right degree, what'll happen is we can form what we call a hard pan out in that soil, and it might be right at that level that we're doing the tillage at. So a lot of times people will disc, for example, on the farm, and they'll disc down to 4 or 5 inches. Well, right at the bottom of that, they will create a hard pan there, and the problem then is the roots can't grow through that very well. So when you go digging later in the summer, everything looks fairly decent, except you get down to that 5-inch level where you had disced at, in too wet a soil, and you realize, uh-oh, I have almost no roots that are getting below that level. So I've got all this soil down below that has water, that has nutrients, that has lots of good stuff for my crop, and my crop just can't get it.
In some areas of the country, we've got really heavy clay soils and they get lots of moisture and don't have adequate subsurface drainage. We'll see some farmers go with something like a field cultivator and run really fast and keep it shallow and try to be maybe at 1.5 inches where they're just barely scratching that surface when the top soil gets a little dry on the top but it's still wet underneath. And we'll see them actually create a hard pan at about 1.5 inches deep. Then they'll slice through and plant corn at 2 inches deep and cut through it when they come back with their planter a few days later as the soil is dried out more. That's a pretty risky proposition, but we do see some guys doing that. And you know, there's just all kinds of crazy things that happen when soil is too wet. And normally what we would advise is just to wait a few days, let that soil dry out. But when it gets down towards the end of the planting window, a guy's got to do what he's got to do to try and get something in the ground, because having a crop is better than having nothing at all.
Yeah, and that's exactly where I was going to go. Just unfortunately, we don't live and farm in a perfect world. And so yes, as farmers, we want to have the soil with a little bit of moisture, but relatively dried out, and then we can do a good job getting out there, having good seed to soil contact, not creating a lot of compaction, either sidewall or, you know, any other type of hard pan out there. But we get against the clock. At some point, we just have to say, hey, I got to take my chances. Am I going to take my chances planting late, or am I going to take my chances going into a little bit wetter soil? And if I go into a little wetter soil, that means I'm going to need to fix this probably over the next few years, because very often we can see what we did 1 year in bad conditions continue to show up for years down the road.
Well, for farmers, a lot of times in the spring, there aren't a whole lot of easy decisions, but controlling our weed of the week is certainly one of them. Can you identify this week's weed?